Good afternoon, everybody. My name is John Swartzberg, and I have the distinct pleasure of introducing my very good friend, Erich Gruen. Professor Gruen received his BA from Columbia University. While he was there, he was a varsity lightweight rower and a valedictorian of his 550-person graduating class. From 1957 to 1960, he was a Rhodes Scholar at Merton College, Oxford. He came back to the United States and received his PhD in history from Harvard University. His early work focused on the Roman Republic, and it culminated in his wonderful book, The Last Generation of the Roman Republic, a book that I've read a couple of times. He has published many other highly acclaimed books and articles. His later work has been on the Hellenistic period and on Judaism in the classical world. Professor Gruen has been at Berkeley since 1964, and he's taught many wonderful classes. I can attest to that, as I was fortunate enough to take his class in the early 2000s on the Roman Republic. And despite his retirement now from full-time teaching, he continues to oversee doctoral dissertations and is widely sought after for visiting professorships. In addition to UC Berkeley, Professor Gruen has taught at Harvard University, the University of Colorado at Boulder, and Cornell University. He told me that his most inspirational teaching, though, was a brief stint instructing prisoners at San Quentin State Prison in the late 2000s. His topic for today is ancient Judaism, nation, ethnicity, or religion. Professor Gruen.
Thank you very much, John. Thank you and others who have been conspiring to bring me here today and talk to this eminent group, and I've been looking forward to it. And I look forward also to the questions and criticisms that may follow what I have to say. How did the Jews define themselves in antiquity? Were they linked by a common ethnicity, or by a religious faith and belief, or by a shared culture and shared traditions, or by a national identity, or all of the above? And why should it matter to us now? Now, this subject, in one form or another, has generated oceans of ink. To engage with it is to enter a scholarly minefield. Practically every word in my title can be contested and has generated dispute, for that matter. First of all, to use the word nation is to court anachronism right away. The very idea of nation or nationhood is preeminently associated with modern history, notably with the creation of new polities starting the late 18th and through the 19th centuries as nation states. And of course, with the notion of nationalism and its often baleful consequences. As for ethnicity, no ancient equivalent for the word exists. In fact, it surfaces for the first time only in the 20th century, used by anthropologists and sociologists. And as is now generally conceded, ethnicity is a fluid, unstable, and manipulated construct rather than an authentic reflection of facts on the ground. The concept remains slippery, elusive, and frustrating. And matters are no easier when you get to the term religion. A number of scholars now reckon its usage to be more misleading than helpful, because the ancient understanding of it was so different from our own. The Greek word threskeia and the Latin word religio, which are often translated as religion, in fact have only rarely to do with anything like faith, belief, doctrine, meanings that we normally assign to religion. Now, all that is bad enough. Even worse is any effort to get a handle on what Judaism means in antiquity. Debate on that thorny issue continues to rage. The Greek word Judaismos almost never appears in any text, whether Jewish or non-Jewish, at least not before its implementation by Christian writers. And that's not just the accident of survival, because the word is altogether absent in the texts of Philo and Josephus, which we do have in abundance, but they never use the word. So this subject is fraught with hazards. It traps await at every step along the way. And then there's that awkward question that I mentioned a minute ago. Why should any of this matter to us? Is this not yet another academic exercise of interest only to a minuscule number of scholars and researchers hoping to get tenure or perhaps to demonstrate their ingenuity? Well, not really, because the topic has striking contemporary resonance of no small import that goes well beyond the academy. In July of 2018, the Israeli parliament, the Knesset, passed a measure of real significance, both symbolic significance and practical significance, and by a relatively narrow vote of 62 to 55. And this ordinance was not just any bill, but to use a technical term, it was a basic law. Now, Israel does not have a written constitution, so the basic laws are the closest that they come to it, because they have the status of constitutional guidelines governing the legal system, and once approved, they are very difficult to repeal. Now, this particular measure declared, and I quote, that the land of Israel is the national home of the Jewish people, in which it fulfills its natural, cultural, religious, and historical right to self-determination. And then it goes on to state, and I quote again, the right to exercise national self-determination in the state of Israel is unique to the Jewish people, unquote. And it further asserts that, I quote again, the state will strive to ensure the safety of the members of the Jewish people in trouble or in captivity due to the fact of their Jewishness or their citizenship. And this declaration, by the way, was not confined just to Jews living in Israel. There's another clause that affirms that this, and I quote again, the state shall act to preserve the cultural, historical, and religious heritage of the Jewish people among Jews in the diaspora. Now, in view of the problematic terminology that I mentioned at the beginning, every one of these clauses is riddled with ambiguity. Not to mention the very troubling clause that says, the state views the development of Jewish settlement as a national value and will act to encourage and promote its establishment and consolidation. Now, despite what you might detect in my tone of voice, it's not my purpose here to comment on current Israeli politics and ideology, for which I don't claim special expertise, though I have my views. But what I want to point out today is that efforts to comprehend ancient usage of concepts like Jewish people, nationhood, homeland, religion, ethnicity, that they do have real resonance in present circumstances, for which the ancient experience might offer to us some insight and maybe offer some corrective to present practices. Let me take another, even more recent instance of comparative value. On December 11th of 2019, President Donald Trump, in his first term, issued an executive order. He's not just issuing executive orders here for the first time today or these days. In 2019, he issued an order that authorized all federal agencies and executive departments to enforce vigorously the provisions of Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibited discrimination in programs receiving federal financial assistance, and it applied this specifically to forms of discrimination rooted in anti-Semitism. Now, that executive order acknowledged that Title VI, though it prohibited discrimination, it did so only on the basis of race, color, and national origin. But on this occasion, by extending its coverage to anti-Semitism, the executive order added a dimension to Title VI that it had previously lacked, namely that which we would normally designate as religion, because it explicitly categorizes discrimination against Jews as falling under Title VI, just as do other forms of discrimination based on race, color, and national origin. So here the Jews are implicitly labeled as a religion rather than a nation or an ethnicity. Now, whether Trump drew those conclusions or not, I cannot say, and I don't much care. But it does reflect the inclinations of those who composed the executive order and who thus viewed Jews as entitled to protection on the basis of their religion, however they may have understood that concept. And that was not altered by the subsequent Biden administration, let alone the current administration with its fraudulent claim of fighting anti-Semitism. So the perception of Jews in antiquity, whether by themselves or in other people's perceptions, as religion or ethnicity or nationality, does have important echoes today and can provoke comparable tensions and debates. Now, I need to define these terms. Now, definitions are inevitably arbitrary, can even be idiosyncratic, but it is essential to offer a delineation of what I mean by them for the purposes of this particular inquiry, if we're going to make any headway. Nation, for the purposes of this discussion, carries the meaning of a collective name, a shared territory, the possession of, or at least the aspiration for, political autonomy. Ethnicity, I identify here first and foremost with common descent and ancestry, whether real or, as often in antiquity, fictitious. And religion, I conceive broadly, not just as faith and belief, but as encompassing ritual, practice, and tradition. Okay, those are my definitions. Now, where do the ancient Jews fall on this spectrum? The concept of nationhood has a checkered history, too often and unfortunately tied up with the notion of nationalism and usually carrying negative connotations. Given its origins in 19th and 20th century Europe, it normally implied an assertive drive to project national sovereignty and extend national authority in a wider world, so that nationalism often expressed itself by subjection of and control over other nations and peoples on an international stage. In short, it turned into imperialism. Now, the very concept of nationalism runs into obstacles right away. Is every nation nationalistic? And what is a nation anyway? The social anthropologist Ernest Gellner neatly turned the tables, and he declared that, I quote, nationalism engendered nations, not the other way around. An interesting formulation. In other words, the nation in this view is like any other imagined community in the terminology of Benedict Anderson. Explications of the meaning of nation are usually nebulous, imprecise, and rarely helpful. Ernest Renan, the great French philosopher and historian of religion, he may have had it right when he said back in 1882 that nationalism is a state of mind and a nation is a spiritual principle. And perhaps the best and certainly the most pungent definition of a nation is that by the political scientist Karl Deutsch, who said, a nation is a group of people united by a common error about their ancestry and a common dislike of their neighbors. That's a very neat and in some ways unexceptional formulation. But none of these formulations get us any closer to our goal. That is, did the ancient Jews conceive their community in terms of what we call nationhood, even though, of course, they never used that term? Well, as is well known, God had promised to the descendants of Abraham a vast territory extending from the rivers of Egypt to the Euphrates. And after the escape of the Hebrews from Egypt in the Exodus story, that promise took on more concrete shape. They would acquire the land of Canaan, allotted to them as an inheritance. The promised land, therefore, became an integral part of Jewish identity in the ancient world. And of course, it remains a force for many people today, for good or ill. Now, did this link to a territorial claim with divine sanction? Did this constitute a sense of identity that corresponded to a nation? How compelling, really, was this objective of regaining the promised land? Well, after the Maccabean rebellion of the middle of the second century BCE, the Jews regained control of the temple and of Jerusalem, and the successors of the Maccabean rebels installed a new ruling dynasty, the Hasmoneans, who governed Judea for well over a century. And in their conflicts with the Seleucid kingdom, the Hellenistic kingdom that was centered in Syria, the Hasmoneans entertained what we might regard and what looked like nationalistic aspirations, namely to regain territory and expand authority on the basis of biblical pronouncements regarding their right to a promised land. And on that scenario, obviously, Zionism and its present day continuation can ostensibly claim precedence in antiquity. And for that view, the most telling piece of testimony comes in the first book of Maccabees, composed in the late second century BCE, which records, or perhaps concocts, a forceful statement by Simon, the brother of Judah Maccabee, head of the Hasmonean house. He addresses an accusation that was made by the Seleucid king Antiochus VII, who said that the Hasmoneans had captured and ravaged cities and territories that rightfully belonged to the Seleucid kingdom. And Simon replied forcefully, the Jews had not occupied other people's lands or seized other people's properties, but were simply reclaiming the inheritance of their ancestors, that is, ostensibly their promised land. If you hear echoes of current disputes, that it may not be purely coincidental. But that particular passage is regularly taken to show the powerful hold that this image retained for Jewish national identity. But one can make too much of this passage, this solitary passage on which so much rests. For one thing, the phrase promised land doesn't even appear in it, nor does that phrase appear anywhere in justification of Hasmonean expansionism and acquisition of land. Furthermore, the Hasmonean conquests don't even correspond to any biblical delineation of territory that would authorize their claims. The rulers of Judea simply fit into the military and imperialistic practices of the Hellenistic powers, the world that the Hasmoneans had inherited and joined, and that the part which they aspired to play in it. The fact is that the idea of a territorial definition of Jewish identity encounters a very serious impediment, namely the diaspora. The scattering of Jews took on major proportions after the conquest of Alexander the Great in the late 4th century BCE. And with that came the installation of new Greek settlements all over the Near East. And numerous Jews were drawn to those new foundations and have remained there for many generations thereafter. it's worth emphasizing, not everyone is aware of this, that in the Greco-Roman period, Jews lived in the diaspora in far greater numbers than those in Palestine. So then where would one even locate the nation? Territorial definition plainly will not do. Now, of course, one can argue that even for the Jews who were living abroad, the large majority, the concept of the homeland still continued to exist. And in an important sense, it certainly did. We have numerous texts composed by diaspora Jews in the Hellenistic period that referred to Jerusalem as the holy city. Symbolism of this was strong, and the connection never lapsed. Yet it was not in and of itself the determinative element of Jewish identity. A sense of nationhood as rooted in the Holy Land simply couldn't do the job. Because the fact is that Jews had formed stable communities in the diaspora, enjoyed civic privileges in numerous cities of the Mediterranean world. And like the Greeks in those city-states, in those poleis, the Jews freely designated themselves as Antiochenes or Ephesians or Alexandrians or wherever they happened to be dwelling. The great Jewish philosopher and exegete Philo of Alexandria put the matter most tellingly. He affirms that Jews considered the holy city of Jerusalem as their metropolis, their mother city. But the states in which they were born and raised, and which they had acquired from their fathers, their grandfathers, and their distant forefathers, those cities and states they regarded as their patrides, their native lands. Now that is notable testimony because it declares that diaspora Jews' engagement with the communities in which they dwelled and had dwelled in many cases for generations, however distant they may be from Jerusalem, but those cities and states, communities, possessed as much or more claim on their allegiance as did the holy city, the emblem of their origins. The idea of a return to the homeland had no practical significance. And indeed, for Jews in the Hellenistic and Roman periods, it didn't serve even as an aspiration. Now, to be sure, Jews all over the Mediterranean world, if circumstances permitted, provided an annual tithe to the temple in Jerusalem, which gave a powerful signal of allegiance. And furthermore, those who had the wherewithal to do so made pilgrimages to the temple, usually at times of festivals and commemorations. And they came from everywhere. The numbers could be quite substantial. Crowds occasionally were overwhelming. But what is to be inferred from this? Certainly not that Jews of the diaspora longed for a much delayed reinstatement to the homeland, which emblematized the true meaning of their nation. If anything, the reverse held, because the pilgrimages, by definition, were temporary, brief visits to pay homage to their traditions before they returned to their communities where they made their homes as their ancestors had before them, and which was a prime source of their identity. The customary payment of the tithe had similar significance. Yes, it dramatized the fact that the diaspora was no fleeting or marginal experience. Rather, it was an indication that the settlers abroad had established an enduring and meaningful existence there. It had become a mainstay of the people's place of origin. So nationhood for the ancient Jews could not coincide with territory, nor could it be reflected in any genuine political autonomy. Circumstances of the Hellenistic and Roman periods rendered that quite impossible. After the so-called return from the Babylonian captivity in the 6th century BCE, Jews had come under the suzerainty first of the Persians, then of the Hellenistic kingdoms, and finally of Rome. Nationalistic ambitions, if there were any, would have to reckon with the fact of a subordinate position within the embrace of an imperial power. Even the successful Maccabean rebellion, which challenged the hegemony of the Seleucid rulers of Syria, and which, of course, is still celebrated every year at Hanukkah as a triumph of the nation. But even that event has to be seen in its broader context, because the successors of Judas Maccabeus, the Hasmonean dynasty, who held sway in Judea for a century, this was supposedly the apex of Jewish nationalism. In fact, they had only a precarious hold on power right from the start. The Seleucids still cast a long shadow. Hasmonean leaders made their greatest gains by supporting one or another contender for the Seleucid throne. Each member of the Hasmonean house held its post through authorization by a Seleucid monarch or a pretender to the Seleucid throne who needed Jewish backing. Imperial authority and Hasmonean fortunes, in fact, were fundamentally interdependent. Jewish leaders received their positions, their titles, their privileges at the hands of Seleucid princes. And in the following century, after the fall of the Seleucid kingdom, governance in Judea by the family of Herod the Great, that was contingent from the very start on the favor of Rome. So the implementation of full autonomy for a Jewish nation was simply never in the cards. In short, any effort to fit Jewish sense of collective identity into some category of nationhood, as it's commonly understood, seems well off the mark. The very concept is a modern one, not an ancient one. Links to a particular territory is very problematic in view of the diaspora. And subordination to an imperial power presented an obstacle to any real or enduring political authority. So much for nationhood. Let's look then at an alternative means of framing a perception of meaningful collective identity, something that we would normally label as ethnicity. Now, as is well known, the ancient Israelites' origin myths, as enshrined in the scriptures, trace the common descent from Abraham, a sacred bond that was sanctioned by a covenant with God as expressed in the laws of Moses. And the Jews indeed did refer to themselves as God's chosen people, noted as such several times in the Bible. And that conceptualization did not limit itself to biblical times. It retained force well into the Hellenistic and Roman period. And this would give the Jews a special distinction, setting them apart in a class by themselves. But wherein lay that distinction? The Jews reckon themselves first and foremost as a descent group, a pure lineage stemming from the patriarchs and carried on through the generations. That is a matter of ethnicity. Well, to be sure, insistence on endogamy, marriage inside the clan, in order to maintain the continuity of the line, this does take prominence in the Pentateuch. From the time of Abraham's search for a wife for his son Isaac within the community, and a shunning of any non-Israelites, especially Canaanites, Moabites, and Ammonites. And Isaac, the son, issued the same injunction to his son Jacob. And even Esau, who strayed at first, took his last wives from inside the clan. So the demand for purity of the race and resistance to exogamy this reached a peak in the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, when after return from the Babylonian exile, when the need for some undeviating display of the lineage seemed to take on special urgency. And yet, The idea that a strict enforcement of marriage boundaries would preserve an ethnic character that would give Jewishness its distinctiveness, this does not fit with most of our evidence. A commitment to endogamy was never undeviating, even in biblical times. The scriptures themselves make that clear. Abraham took the Egyptian maidservant Hagar as his wife and then married another non-Israelite after Sarah's death. Nor did the sons of Jacob adhere to any rigorous code of marriage within the ethnic group. Judah married a Canaanite, Joseph an Egyptian, without stirring any negative comment, or indeed any comment at all. Moses' wife, Zipporah, was daughter of a Midianite. Gideon wed a Shechemite. Samson wed a Philistine. David had at least 2 foreign wives, including Bathsheba. And Solomon, of course, had a house full of alien women as his consorts. The genealogies that we get in the first book of Chronicles, they trace biblical lineages, beginning already with Adam, and do so in numbing detail, if you ever read through it. But they include explicit references to non-Israelite wives, to Moabites, to former Egyptian slaves, to concubines of unspecified origins. The idea of an unalloyed lineage was never enshrined in the tradition. In fact, it was a mixed multitude, so says the book of Exodus, that accompanied Moses out of Egypt. And when Philo of Alexandria, the Jewish philosopher, when he expressed the notion of Jewish commonality, he does so almost always in terms of customs, practice, and adherence to tradition. Genealogy is a secondary matter at best. The philosopher at one point asks an explicit question drawn from the book of Deuteronomy. And he asks, what is this great people that brings God so near to them and earns them his favor? And Philo's answer is that they are lovers of wisdom and knowledge. They are people who seek after greatness, which consists first and foremost in proximity to God. So for Philo, as is clear, it is the character of the people, not anything that is inherited in the bloodline, that earns them the benefactions of the Lord. And he asserts more than once that the quality of the descent group is intricately intertwined with allegiance to its chosen code of laws and the highest standards of conduct. And the endurance of that legacy lay in the exercise, he says, of righteousness and virtue. Now, Philo does refer to the Israelites as an ethnos. And of course, we get the word ethnicity from that. But the term in Greek carries a wide range of meaning, and it appears in a variety of ways in Philo's own works, but only rarely in his work with the connotation of what we might regard as an ethnic group. So, for instance, as Philo put it, the ethnos that Moses led was appointed to offer up prayers for humankind itself in warding off evils and sharing what is good. In the philosopher's representation, the people were appointed, the Jewish people were appointed to offer up prayers for humankind in warding off evils and sharing what is good for all. So that in the philosopher's representation, it is the values of his ethnos, no mere genealogy, that characterized the chosen people. Philo, interestingly, can even describe kinship itself in terms of common customs and faithfulness to tradition. In fact, he even goes further. He has Moses express the fact that the whole ethnos from the start had the most compelling kinship with God, far more genuine, he says, than that of a blood tie, because it makes it the heir of all good things that human nature allows. So Philo frames the notion of genuine kinship solely as the piety of good men. And that formulation signifies that kinship, in its purest sense for Philo, eclipses any relationship by blood. It is a metaphorical notion that removes it from the bounds of a descent group. The Jews were chosen for their practice of virtue, rationality, and justice, not for their ancestry. Now, if you look at the writings of Josephus, the Jewish historian, you'll find that he reached similar conclusions. He too counts his own people, his genos, as the chosen people of God. But what exactly made them so? Certainly not race or ethnicity alone. God bestowed his favor upon them, says Josephus, because of their zeal for virtue, their choice of a life free from wickedness. Josephus regularly described Jews in terms of practices, cult, and ritual, reverence for the scriptures, and indefatigable loyalty to the law. So there's a multiform sense of collective consciousness that prevailed, well beyond just the lineage of Abraham. And in a summary statement, Josephus declares that the Jewish people have a code of laws that is ideally suited for their piety, their concord with one another, their humaneness in general, their righteousness, their steadfastness in adversity, and their scorn of death. He passes over, without a word, any suggestion that Jews possessed an ethnic character that stemmed from common ancestry. Josephus took pride in the claim that peoples everywhere have imitated and adopted characteristic Jewish values, such as observing the Sabbath, philanthropy, internal harmony, devoted labor in the arts, steadfastness in adhering to the demands of the laws. Those were the features that sprang readily to mind when the historian spoke of the character of the ethnos. I want to mention a third Jewish writer whose lifetime overlapped with those of Philo and Josephus, and who also needs to be taken into account. I refer to St. Paul, who adds an important and illuminating dimension to this topic. Now, Paul was fond of dichotomies, the most familiar of which, of course, is that which divided the whole world between Judaioi and ta ethne, between Jews and Gentiles, basically. But wherein lay the difference between them? Or to put the matter more pointedly, did Paul conceive it as an ethnic divide? Well, it's noteworthy, maybe surprising to some, that ethnic distinctions scarcely ever appear in the Pauline letters. So how would Paul characterize Jewish identity then? He does, to be sure, trace his own origins and those of his people to Abraham. And in doing so, he employs language that certainly would suggest direct descent. Abraham he presents as our forefather in accordance with the flesh, kata sakra. And the Israelites, or Hebrews, are the seed of Abraham, says Philo. Now, on the face of it, that seems straightforward enough as an index of genealogical derivation. But Paul, in fact, is not so straightforward on this matter. The seed of Abraham has a metaphorical connotation that takes it out of the realm of the pure physical. The designation of Abraham as ancestor in the flesh resolves itself into a figurative description that underscores his role as exemplar, both for the non-Jews who practice justice and the Jews who have their patriarch as their model. So that despite the language of seed and flesh, the bloodline is not at issue here. Paul makes the point with greater explicitness later in his letter to the Romans. Also, with regard to Abraham's descendants, he declares that it is not the children of the flesh who are the children of God, but the children of the promise, who are reckoned as the seed. And in the epistle to the Galatians, the apostle underscores that meaning unambiguously. He identifies the sons of Abraham as the men of faith. So that plainly the metaphor of self and or seed or descent, which one might expect to be a quintessential marker of ethnic identity, that can, for Paul, serve simply to signal a continuity of belief. And perhaps the most pertinent passage for this inquiry Paul addresses himself directly to Jews or prospective Jews, and he opens with the provocative words, "If you call yourself a Jew." Opening with that, one would expect here, if anywhere, would expect Paul to be giving clues as to what he considers the essence of Jewishness, or at least what it ought to be. But as the apostle formulates it, says, "He who calls himself a Jew and rests upon the law and the boasts of God, who knows the will of God and discerns what is superior and is instructed in the law, thus makes himself a guide for the blind, a light for those in darkness, a mentor of the foolish, a teacher of the young, having in the law the expression of knowledge and truth." It's worth here accentuating the fact that in this, the fullest outline of attributes that bind together Jews, no mention surfaces of belonging to a line of descent. Everything centers upon morality, conduct, performance, and adherence to the law that embodies them. The Jews were unconstrained by the straitjacket of ethnic determinism. That passage denies implicitly that lineage or genetic disposition represents an inescapable constituent of identity. Paul's emphasis falls consistently upon characteristic conventions, commitment to traditions, conformance to the law, and indeed belief. In short, Philo, Josephus, and Paul, the three most important surviving Jewish authors of the whole Second Temple period, they all come down firmly on the side of what we would call religion, not ethnicity. And we can reinforce this conclusion by pointing to another feature that played a very significant role in ancient Jewish experience. The Jews were open to and certainly did not discourage the embrace of Judaism by Gentiles. Josephus even maintains that there was not a city or a people, whether Greek or barbarian, he says, to which Jewish observance of the Sabbath, fasts, lighting of lamps, dietary regulations, not a single people to whom this has not spread. And Philo went even further to affirm that the Sabbath and Yom Kippur are honored by Greeks and non-Greeks alike, by those who dwell in Europe and Asia, indeed in the whole world, from one end to the other. Now, of course, those statements are rhetorical outbursts, not to be taken literally. But it isn't Jewish writers alone who attest this. Pagan sources that we have also refer to the apostasy of their compatriots to Judaism, their embrace of Judaism, the growing number of Jews, which was a matter of some alarm, at least ostensibly so, for some pagans like Seneca and Tacitus and Juvenal. Now, those notices also are exaggerated, to be sure, because the Jews were not proselytizers. There's no clear evidence that can be adduced for Jewish missionary activity in the Greco-Roman world. Nevertheless, though there may not have been proselytizers, there were certainly proselytes. For this, we have abundant epigraphic and literary testimony. Proselytes often identify themselves as such on inscriptions, and there are a variety of instances that crop up in the literary sources as well. They take for granted the possibility that Gentiles, even occasionally Gentile rulers, could shake off their hallowed traditions and become, in some sense, Jews. Now, what does this mean for a comprehension of Jewish collective identity? We have little clue about what conversion to Judaism entailed, what steps needed to be taken, what hoops had to be jumped through, if any. But the very fact of conversion, in whatever form, is a feature of supreme importance. The boasts of Philo and Josephus, the laments of Seneca and Tacitus, the inscriptions on stone from Rome, Asia Minor, and elsewhere that attest to proselytes, and the entertaining stories, whatever their validity, about acceptance of Judaism by benighted pagans and former enemies even, all this shows that adoption of Judaism by non-Jews in some form or other was a known and a not uncommon occurrence. And that itself tells the most important tale. Because if non-Jews could readily enter into the nation of the Jews, that nation clearly did not define its essence in terms of descent from the patriarchs or an ethnic character carried in the genes, let alone identification with a native land or a political dominion. A sense of Jewishness rested on a range of traditions and practices that were open to outsiders rather than confined to a narrow exclusivity. Now, this doesn't quite nail down the point. I want to approach it in the time I have left, which is very little, approach this matter from a different angle. The Jews may have represented themselves largely in terms of cult, worship, sacred scriptures, and a law code with divine sanction. But how did others perceive them? Now, on this score, we're quite handicapped. Very few Greek or Roman writers spilled any ink over Jews. And our extant texts include no extensive treatment by Greeks or Romans about Jews at all. We possess only fragments, bits and pieces, offhand remarks, sometimes later quotations that are selective and largely minimal. But putting them together doesn't lack value in seeing some kind of a tentative picture of Gentiles' perception of Jews. Now, the very little time that I have left allows only a very brief look at the comments of Roman writers and intellectuals, which isn't bad because the Greeks had very little to say about the Jews at all. Now, Roman writers, regardless of their particular predilections or the genres in which they worked, they show a striking uniformity. They refer repeatedly and consistently to Jewish ritual, practices, beliefs, not to ethnicity, not to nationhood. And there's a notable point that deserves stress here. The Romans included no reference to Jewish ethnic traits, no reference to their appearance, to their speech, to any inherited or genetic characteristics, or any qualities that associated with racial origins that might suggest an alien presence in their midst. Ethnicity was irrelevant for the Romans. Religion almost alone sprang to mind when Romans paid any attention to Jews. The very fact that Romans regarded Jews essentially as practitioners of a religion, this carries real significance. Jewish religious customs struck many Romans as strange, unusual, even absurd. They were a source of humor and mockery and derision. But they didn't regard them as stemming from some alien breed that was forever mired in an ethnicity that stamped the Jews with an indelible national character. The expressions of pagan authors, therefore, however scattered, however sketchy, they run remarkably parallel and they reinforce the same impressions that are delivered by the expansive texts of Philo or Josephus or Paul. The ancient Jews, in their own perception and in that of others, presented the image of a religious group, one that was bound by ritual and worship and common practices and tradition and devotion to sacred books and laws. Their self-reflectiveness stressed continuity and solidarity, but it didn't rest on a conception of nationhood based on geography or political autonomy, nor did it succumb to a belief in an inborn or fixed ethnic nature that would set them irrevocably apart from all others. The expression of their collective identity was rooted in long-standing practices, principles, and a trust in divinely inspired law. Such matters can properly be characterized as religion, although perhaps in its wider sense of a religious culture. Jewish self-consciousness rested largely on convictions, principles, and traditions that could be shared with others and that resisted any notion of exclusive races. Well, are there any inferences to be drawn with regard to the Middle East today? Such inferences could only be very cautious and very tentative. But it might be worth noting that if belligerent parties today could look upon one another not as locked into an undeviating and irreversible nature as entities or as entities contending for national territory on a zero-sum basis, but rather as defined by tradition, observances, and rituals that are not in conflict with others, indeed are open to others. This could be a step towards mutual respect and an advance toward concord that is so badly needed in that region of our troubled world. Thank you very much.